You're listening to a Life in Quebec podcast. For more, visit lifeinquebec.com.
This article, named Federal Election Financing, An Eye on the Money, was originally published in the December 2015 edition of Life in Quebec magazine. Let's talk about politics and money. For many, this is a dirty topic. Putting money and politics in the same sentence immediately raises suspicion. I was certainly sensitive to this when, late last summer, I accepted responsibility for the finances of the federal election campaign of a candidate in the Quebec City region. In light of my experience, however, I do feel it's important to be comfortable talking about the realities and misconceptions of how money and politics interact, at least at the level at which I worked. I also want to assure listeners that, in our campaign and all those I observed, I saw no hint of illegal or unethical behavior. I don't claim to be an expert on how political financing works as a whole. I'm at best an experienced novice who learned a lot about how things work behind the scenes of a federal election campaign. For starters, allow me to try to give a grossly oversimplified explanation of how campaign financing works in theory. I learned this and so much more within the first few days of being official agent and campaign director for a federal campaign. All federal campaigns, provincial campaigns follow a different set of rules, raise money through individual donations that cannot exceed a fixed amount per year. In 2015, that was $1,500. Donations from non-citizens, from corporations, or from people who've already donated the maximum amount are illegal. Although each candidate's campaign is theoretically financially independent, campaigns are free to give and take as much money as they want from each other. There's no limit on how much a party's campaign can give to a local candidate, for instance, so long as all the money originally comes from legal donations. There's also no limit on when these donations can be made, so long as they're under the donor's annual limit. So most candidates and parties try to collect donations outside of election years in order to have as much as possible on hand once the writ drops. Then comes election spending. There's a maximum amount of money that a campaign can spend, which is set by Elections Canada according to the size of the riding and the length of the campaign. For a regular 37-day election, this comes to about $90,000 for a typical riding in 2011 figures. But for the absurdly long 78-day election of 2015, that figure was about $220,000. If you're wondering why the election campaign was so long, keep in mind only the Conservative Party could possibly reach that figure in most ridings, and the Conservatives call the long election. At the end of the campaign, if the candidate collects at least 10% of votes in their riding, the campaign receives 60% reimbursement of their expenses from Elections Canada, that is to say, from taxpayers. Politics is no path to wealth. This might lead people to imagine that politics is a path to wealth. Actually, by and large, there's not much money in politics. Most people I spoke with during the campaign were surprised to learn that no one on our team was receiving a salary of any kind. As far as I can tell, our campaign was not exceptional in this. While this might seem reassuring, especially in light of how our US neighbors seem to spend limitless amounts of money on professional political operatives, the reality is not so bright. Without any guaranteed financial compensation, the average Canadian is not financially able to independently participate in the electoral process. In practice, only the wealthy, the privileged, or those willing and able to take on significant debt can seek office or staff a campaign. In theory, the Elections Canada reimbursement is supposed to mitigate this somewhat. Campaign staff salaries, when there are any, are eligible for that reimbursement. The idea being that since political involvement is itself a service to the state has some obligation to compensate for at least part of the cost. Given that Elections Canada only reimburses expenses that have already been paid, however, the campaign still needs to raise the money required to pay those salaries in the first place, which for some local campaigns simply isn't possible. How many people do you know who would write you a $1,500 check? All the same, some people do make the sacrifices necessary to participate in the process. I'm not only talking about the candidates, but also the small armies of volunteers who freely give up their time, usually without promise of any reward, simply to promote their values and ensure our democratic process works. I have the utmost respect for anyone who chooses to do this. Far too few people truly understand the sacrifices required. Ultimately, elections aren't won by money alone. They're won by ideas and the people who share them. From what I've seen, I do sincerely believe this. Money might help expose people to a party's or a candidate's idea, share those ideas through flyers and advertising, provide room rentals for meetings, pay for phone lines, and feed volunteers to keep them going. But if the ideas aren't what voters want, there's simply no amount of money that will change that. You simply can't spend your way onto a ballot.
Thank you for listening to the Life in Quebec podcast. For more news, commentary, editorials and opinion, visit lifeinquebec.com/podcast.